I think we had a very short timeline. I know 2.5 years sounds like a long time, but relatively speaking, it was a short time span. So making sure we could get the story right, have the time to get the story correct was probably the biggest challenge. And to do that, it meant just that the story and all of the departments were overlapping. We were making the movie at the same time we were trying to finish writing it, and that overlap was probably the biggest challenge.
Let's see, for me, I pitched it about 5 years ago, so I think hanging in there, patience, knowing that there was a great story in here. We took several versions to get there, and but anyway, it was, just sort of persevering to get to the end.
Yeah, and speaking of the end, for me, Chris had way back pitched the notion of, and now that you've seen it, I can say it, that, honest choice, the act of true love would be something different than romantic love, and we loved that. But to earn that emotionally, that moment, I knew it had to be a big movie, and you had to have parallel plots running at the same time. So I think for me it was the complexity of the film, writing that in order to get to that moment and have it resonate.
Lino?
I'd have to say it was truth in acting, truth in emotion. Jen's writing is so rich, and the characters there's so much depth there that as an animator, it's such a juicy moment to have characters that are written so well. And again, it's exploring and getting in there for truth in acting.
I kind of agree with Peter. The biggest challenge for me in editorial was just we lost a year in our production schedule, and it was so aggressive, and the story was being reworked so many times that it felt like it got to editorial always in the 11th hour. And so it was just a lot of late nights, a lot of weekends, just trying to get the movie up on reels to get ready for our screens.
Now that's interesting. Usually when we talk about animation, we sort of try to explain to people that you normally edit before you shoot.
That is correct, yeah. It starts in, once we get a script approval, it goes to storyboard artists who immediately begin blocking out the sequences almost like a comic book, and then the first step is it goes to editorial, where we'll put it together with scratch dialogue, temp sound effects, temp music, and we'll build the whole movie this way and hopefully get some approvals before one frame of animation is even created.
So was that process different than in this picture because of the short schedule, or was it just happening?
Just meant the turnarounds, I think, had to be faster. And we screen the movie probably about every 12 weeks for ourselves, and bring in all the other directors and writers and talk about what's working, what's not working, how do we make the movie stronger, and then it sort of all gets torn apart again. And Chris and Jen and Jeff all have to piece it back together, hopefully each time better.
Now I have a little personal confession to make here. I edited a lot of the screenwriting coverage at Variety, and last year we were huge fans of Wreck-It Ralph, and we put Jennifer Lee on our list of sort of freshmen in the Oscar race as writers having their first screenplay. I was up for awards consideration, and this year I edited our 10 screenwriters to watch, which was announced on Friday and will be in this upcoming issue, and Jennifer is one of them. And with all this, I've never met Jennifer until 10 minutes ago. So I'm really excited. I'm wondering for Jennifer and Chris, can you talk a little bit about turning this Hans Christian Andersen story into something that's for a visual medium? And also, my recollection of Hans Christian Andersen is that it's pretty dark. And how do you work with that darkness without throwing it out completely?
Well, it was a particularly challenging story because for several reasons, and the biggest ones are it's wonderfully poetic and symbolic, and you drift around, it's very ethereal, but all those things are the exact things that are very difficult to do in a concrete medium like film. And also the Snow Queen, who was the most intriguing character to us, you know nothing about her. She's just evil, and there are also, some very dark tones, and it's a coming of age that has sort of more sexual undertones and things like that.
Perfect for Disney.
Yeah. So, but what it did have that we loved is it had very strong female characters. It had a fantastic theme that we hadn't done before, which was the idea in the original. It's love versus negativity, and we sort of translated that to love versus fear, and that's a theme we haven't explored at Disney. and it drew us in. And so that was kind of the thing we knew we wanted to hold on to, but we did feel free to then say, who is the Snow Queen, and what do we want her to be? What's the most exciting thing to explore with her? And maybe not be a villain.
And then we had the Anna character. In the book, there's a little girl called Gerda, and she basically was Anna. We became, we made her into Anna, because Gerda's all about love, and that's what propels her to save her friend, her little, it's a little boy called Kai, who's been captured by the Snow Queen. And so it really is, there were a lot of similarities in that way. We took ideas from the original,
And we gave a lot of Kai's situation to Elsa. So
Right.
we constantly go back, and they've got trolls, and it's
There's a reindeer.
Norway and reindeers, and there's a lot of stuff that we just kept pulling from.
But we had to make it our own, and I've always been sort of inspired by Walt when I heard the idea, or when I read the original Pinocchio, where Pinocchio is my favorite movie, animated movie of Walt's, and where I read the book and was horrified that Pinocchio actually squashed Jiminy Cricket in the first chapter of the book, and I thought, oh my God! But Walt made a very wise decision and kept Jiminy alive, and he's kind of the heart and soul of that movie. So I felt if Walt could do it, we could make a few changes too.
My mother was traumatized by Pinocchio in advance of the screening, which was a little girl. They had to help her from the theater in tears just thinking about what was going to happen to Pinocchio in that movie. So that darkness has been in Disney movies with every generation of us. Lion King with the father dying. We all get some sort of trauma in there. So I want to ask Peter, how long have you been on the picture, and then can you tell us sort of like the genesis of this? I understand it goes way back in the history of Disney, and yet this has never come to fruition until now.
Well, it is a movie that Walt Disney himself wanted to bring to the screen. We didn't realize that when we started the project. We actually learned that somewhat after the fact. And I know you guys just saw some recent drawings that were done. But there have been several attempts to bring the movie to the screen. I think for many of the reasons Jen mentioned, it was a very difficult story to write, a very complex story to write, to bring to the screen. I've been on the project 2.5 years, even though Chris pitched the movie almost 5 years ago. 2.5 years ago is when John said, we want to make your version of the movie. And so it's been a fairly quick run.
This is kind of short. All right, let's talk about the character that probably steals the movie, and that's Olaf. This is for Lino. There's an interesting thing. He's a very expressive character, and yet he doesn't have a lot of features. Can you tell us about the challenges of bringing a character to life who doesn't have all the features of a normal human face?
Yeah. Olaf is one of those characters that between how Olaf was written, because the interesting thing with Olaf is reading reviews now, people refer to him as a sidekick. The thing is, we never animated him that way just because he represents the innocence and love of the sisters. So when we were animating Olaf, we were always going for an honesty in the performance. And so obviously, as an animator, your objective is to service the script and the story. So we never approached Olaf as like, how crazy can we get with him, and how can we make him slight? We never approached it that way, and that fed into the exploration of the character. The thing is, one of the basic principles, obviously, is caricaturing what you know in Truth and Materials, and we made a very early decision that if we're going to go all the way with Olaf and make him be who he is, which is a snowball, he's segmented, he's 3 snowballs on top, his nose is a carrot, and we said if his arms are going to be sticks, we're not going to bend them. They bend in one sequence in the film, which is the dream sequence, because he envisioned himself as the perfect snowman. He can bend his arms. But the domino effect that had, that little doing the homework and research and making the decision. Like I remember the day we pitched that to John. John, we're not gonna bend his arms. We're gonna treat them like sticks. And he's like, what? Oh, okay. And then we showed him a few tests, and he was sold. But like I was saying, the domino effect of having a simple thing like his arms not bend, it forces the animators into doing some critical thinking of getting out of a scene. like scratching your head or reaching for an object, and then the physics of a walk, how that turns into a waddle instead of a walk, and then exploring the innocence in the character. And it feels like what we did really well is do our homework and do a lot of research, and then you end up in a really organic, nice, honest place.
Jeff, I wanted to ask you about some of the challenges of editing a musical. You know, it's a whole different craft creating a Broadway musical. And this is very much a classic kind of Broadway score and structure. You know, and the old timers would talk about having a 9 o'clock number. You know, and it was really a thing to create a Broadway musical. How much is editing a musical different from editing something that relies less on music and musical numbers?
Well, I think, you know, you look at the film as a whole, and obviously how the songs are going to be placed within and help tell the story, and I think that's very important as we're kind of just laying it out within the storytelling and the characters. I also think one of the biggest challenges with working with a musical is that I have a set time that I can do my editing. I can't open anything up, and I have to tell a lot of stories sometimes within the first verse or the first chorus. And sometimes our board artists might get a little ambitious, and we'll get a lot of different ideas in their boards, and half the time we have to come back and just say, we got to strip this down to just one idea and just really work on what's important to telling the story. And I think that was the biggest challenge with that.
Let me throw this open to everybody, but especially for Jennifer and Chris. Talk about creating that Scandinavian look. Tell us about the research that you did and about the details that really place that visually in that part of the world.
Well, John is he's always pushing us to do research. And so our art director, Mike Giamo, who just did a beautiful job, I think, and he was going through all these books of things that would have inspired him for our environment. And he put Post-its in all the pages, and it turns out that as he went back, and all these pages that he had picked were from Norway. And so we decided to send our artistic crew to Norway. It was a small group that went there, and again, they brought back so much beautiful research. Oh, there they are. And there's Mike's on the right there with their crew. So they went and just the fjords, that's a stave church over there on the left. That was the inspiration for the castle, the Arundel Castle. And anyway, just the beautiful architecture. Then there's this folk art that they have called rosemalling, which is in the architecture but also in the clothing. So a lot of that, the clothing thing you see there, yeah, it's all that beautiful artwork they have there. The little designy stuff, and so it was a huge inspiration. And we're not saying that the movie is set in Norway, but it's in Arendal, fictional place. But at least it gave us a jumping off point and a place that, you know, we always say that we're not doing realistic worlds, but at least they're believable worlds. And it's nice to have this kind of foundation to play off from.
From a storytelling point of view, what really helped me was you've got these giant vast fjords with this huge adventure. I mean, the mountains just drop off, and we're going to cover it in snow, and it's going to be very epic. And yet you've got, with the rosemalling and the Norwegian wood and you have an intimacy in the kingdom. You have a warmth that's just innate in the costumes and innate in the architecture. It gives you that sense of intimacy against a giant scope. So for me, it was just a fantastic balance. Visually in my head, but also just in terms of emotionally to draw the story along with that.
And Mike wanted to do also, our castle's different from a lot of the other castles and some of our films where the castle will be on the top of the hill or top of the mountain. So we had the Arundel Castle nestled at the bottom. It's actually on the water and nestled, you know, in the mountains, and sort of saying story-wise that this kingdom is really or the castle is really a part of the kingdom. They don't rule from above.
Yeah,
you know?
we didn't make our girls royal because let's say princesses. We made them royal to put the stakes on them. When you have a kingdom that is depending on you, and then this, one of you accidentally caused an eternal winter and the other's trying to save, we have real stakes. But by making it all happen in Arundel, it's so intimate that you felt like you could feel that they weren't these like girls put up on a pedestal.
I saw this movie about 5 days after getting back from a trip to Finland. And it was kind of strange because somehow it felt like I'd just been there. And Finland isn't Norway. It's not mountainous in the same way, at least not in the south where I was. But somehow it felt right, especially that little reference to the sauna, which is such a thing. I wanted to, really for Peter, but for anybody, in America, 3D is sort of reacquired a bad reputation. But you see this movie, and you can see the real potential of it. I'm wondering if you talk about using 3D creatively and really using it expressively.
Well, for this movie, we're fortunate that we're making the 3D version at the same time we're making the mono version of the movie, so side by side. So, in fact, I think we finished the stereo version about 1 week after we finished the whole movie. But particularly with all the ice and snow and the dynamic nature of Elsa, it really gave us, again, enhanced it more into a believable world.
The snow in this is so it's so textural. You really, as someone who grew up in a snowy climate, this feels like snow. It doesn't feel, movie snow often doesn't feel like snow. A lot of the time it was cornflakes or whatever it was, and you see it falling on people and you're going, snow? That doesn't really look like snow. But we sort of go with it because it's the movies. And this, you really kind of nailed it.
What's interesting is when we were exploring how the snow was going to behave in the film, because there's a style of animation in the film, and getting the snow to behave to complement, and this goes with the clothing in the film as well, to complement the style of animation that we were doing in the film, to get the snow to match so it didn't feel like animated characters over live action. When we started the simulation process, that's where we started, was let's see what it looks like out of the box and what the physics looks like, and it looked bizarre. It was weird. So we started caricaturing certain aspects of the clumping, and we took a trip to Wyoming with the effects artists and the animators. And we did all kinds of tests, from throwing a snowball down a hill and see how it collected, and comparing that to what the simulations were giving us. So what's funny is this scene right here kind of proved, because we imagined when the simulation ran and we got it dialed it in, the sim gave us something very similar to this. But when we saw it in the computer, like, it's never gonna collect like that and roll. And then we went to Wyoming and we threw the snowball, and it was like, it does.
I think it's important, we always knew right from the beginning we didn't want our characters just walking on top of a white surface. We did want them to be interacting with the environment. And the tool set didn't exist when we started the film, called Matterhorn is one of them. And that was developed alongside the artists with our technology group to be able to do the kind of interaction you see in the movie.
I'm wondering if, for anybody, what's the importance of actually getting out there, going to Norway, going to the mountains, going to be with real snow, and not just looking, as we just had, at a video? Why is it so important to be there? What do you get from that?
I know that I've done several research trips, and as an animator, as a director, all types of things. There is, sometimes you bring back certain things that come into the story that you would never have thought of. I know in Lion King, the Hakuna Matata phrase came from people just hearing it, the artists just hearing that phrase all over the place. And in this one, we had our artists, they found a little CD in a little gift shop in Norway, and that was the music that you hear at the very beginning while the snowflakes are forming during the title sequence. And it's a music we use at the end when Elsa's raising up all the snow at the end. Little gems like that you find that you would never be able to find, or on the internet or somewhere else. And then it is just being in the world, and Lino can speak to actually walking in snow and feeling it, and really knowing what the character is going through, if you want.
Yeah. The thing is that what Wyoming did for us animation-wise was recalibrate our thinking of how far you could progress in really snowy, deep conditions. Because our very early test before we went to Wyoming, we would have characters walking really deep in snow and they would progress fairly quickly. But going to Wyoming, and especially walking in snow that was 3 or 4 feet deep and had different layers of crust that you would kind of collapse through, you'd realize it, especially at 5,000 feet, after a few steps, you'd have to.
This is an important video, because watch, Lino leaves her behind.
Every man for himself.
Yeah. Christoph didn't, but there she goes.
But when we went, this is actually one of the scenes from the film. So before this trip, we actually had a couple of sequences when Christoph and Anna run out of the forest and they're being chased by Marshmallow. We wanted to get kind of the capture that depth and how quickly you could fall and be off balance. But the truth in that, I feel like, especially when you see Anna before she goes into Ogun's cabin, and she's picking up her dress and she's kind of slogging through the snow, like finding that button, the truth to caricature, the right thing, the honesty behind that is because of these trips.
And coming from someone who came from outside of animation, and what I've learned over the last few years, and I really admire, is we say it's like not real world but believable, and that's a very delicate balance, because if you push animation too real, it loses its magic, and yet if you don't have it so that it feels organic, you lose its magic. So it's like there's this constant, you have to do all your homework and all your research and know it, and then you have to find the language and the style of it for this film. And that's what it blew me away working with these guys, is always going on emotion and feeling, like that doesn't feel right, is a lot of what we say. And so it's just a really different world.
A lot of that even related to our sound design. So I grew up in Nebraska. I was there for 20 years, and I know exactly what snow looks like, sounds like. I know what a quiet winter day. And I was constantly working with our sound designer saying, no, that doesn't sound, no, it should be thicker, it should be wetter. At one point, he even went out onto a frozen lake with a microphone, and he could actually record the cracking of the ice, which was kind of scary for him at the time. But some of that's actually ended up in the movie. So we're just very concerned about keeping this very real and very authentic.
We're going to take questions from the audience in a few minutes, so get your questions ready in the meantime. I wanted to ask you about the decision to, as you say, have that act of love that is critical to the picture not be an act of romantic love. One of my pet peeves on Hollywood pictures is that it's always about getting the guy or the girl, no matter what the story is. Don't get me started on Good Will Hunting, where he gives up the whole thing at MIT to drive west to San Francisco for Mini Driver. If I were his dad, I'd have slapped him around. But I thought that's one of the things I really enjoyed about this picture, is that finally we have a picture where that is a thing, but it's not the only thing. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, when I first pitched it, that idea was in there, not quite like this, but I had always, I think, Disney's done it very well in the past, where, it is the kiss from the male lead that is the act of true love. But having, been married for over 20 years, and it was also romantic love versus real love. Romantic love for me lasted about 6 months with the hearts and roses and all that. But then the real love kicked in, the real love of the messiness, the hard times, plus the good times. But that to me was the real love. And I started playing around with that idea. And then it was an idea of, can an act of true love, can it be something different, especially for a Disney movie, than just that kiss from the male lead? And that led us to this. There are other forms of true love, and especially this, more familial love that we ended up with, which is just as powerful. So that initial thing started there, and then we just kept shaping and shaping.
Yeah,
it.
we felt like, you know, for me, Anna's journey it's a coming of age in a sense where she goes from sort of a naive understanding of love to the most sophisticated understanding of love, which is sacrifice and family. And that's the journey a lot of us go through. So we didn't want to mock the romantic side because it's very real. I mean, how many of us, like you're 17, 18, you fall in love, and a week later you're like, I'd die for him. You know, and you grow, you go through it. It's real. So we didn't want to mock her, but also we can all go, oh yeah. But take her on that journey for real. And at the end of the day, for a lot of us, and we talk about a lot, is it's your family that you have. And so Anna's journey, even though it's parallel stories, actually is adding up to the same thing. And that was just very important to us.
And anybody who's a parent of teenage girls can tell you about the guy who seems perfect and then turns out to really be a heel.
Yep.
All right. Now I'm going to ask a sort of, this is a different kind of question. I covered Tangled, and I remember I asked about this when we were covering Tangled, and I heard that there was a lot of conversation about it within Disney, and that it's still a topic, which is how big to make those girls' eyes. Because my feeling is that the more that CG animation edges toward realism, the more realistic the environment becomes, the more textural it feels, the stranger those big eyes begin to look. You're laughing because I bet you've had this conversation.
Well, they're actually, their eyes are actually smaller than Rapunzel's
Significantly.
eyes.
Yeah,
significantly smaller.
I think you're reacting to that same issue.
Well, what's difficult is the eyes are the most expressive part. And so, and for us, we built rigs that we've never had before where we could do subtext, such subtlety on the face, but to get you to read emotion, two girls standing next to each other, you can almost read what's going on in their heads even when they're saying nothing. That's, I mean, really challenging. And so it's always a struggle just to make sure the most important thing is that you can feel what's going on with these characters. And we put that first.
Yeah, Lena, you worked on both, so I don't know what you...
The thing is, what we did was, early on in the process, we actually brought Rapunzel up when we were building Anna and Elsa, always as a reference, and we actually brought up literally all of the female characters that have ever been in a Disney film. And the most important thing was the iterative process of going over Anna and Elsa, and appeal-wise, pushing, pulling things, and then always going back to look at Rapunzel, and then going back to our characters, just to make sure the goal was that Anna and Elsa should feel like they are characters in Frozen, and they're not mimicking anything that we've done in the past. But when you look at Anna or Elsa next to Rapunzel, there's no similarities. Obviously, if you pick a certain angle, which people have done online, of Rapunzel looking three-quarter from under her brows and Anna or Elsa three-quarters from under her brows in the same lighting condition, they're going to look similar, but they don't share any traits.
No, what I think what's interesting though is this idea that you've actually made those big Disney eyes smaller with these characters, and it doesn't feel. It feels the same. It feels like they're just as big and expressive, but they're actually no longer sort of got that alien look.
Yeah,
I guess we succeeded. Or your eyes? Or...
Yeah, I think so.
What helps too, though, is we work with our hand-drawn artists a lot, and there is a look that I've always admired where I think some of the best expressive human characters were done by Disney, and so we use those hand-drawn inspirations for the CG, and Mark Ken was in the animation room drawing on top of our CG, and here's some examples of developing the expressions.
These were
for
done
CG.
these were done by Jin Kim, and Jin and I also worked on Tangled. I supervised the Flynn animation in Tangled, and Jin and I did this very iterative process of I do some animation tests, Jin and I would get together, and Jin would do these amazing drawings over my animation, and we did very similar things here where we knew we wanted to capture certain moments, and we'd get together and Jin would do these sketches the guy is amazing. Like, you look at the appeal of these drawings, I never get sick of looking at them. They're amazing. But the idea was, if we can capture the nuance and subtleties of the drawing, and we can actually use that as our starting base for building the characters, that we all felt like we're going to be in good shape.
Having been in Finland recently, I can attest that that country is filled with blonde men and women who are every bit as pretty as these drawings. That was one of the reasons.
A funny thing about Finland, the trolls were very inspired in the design of the trolls. They found this pictures of, it was like the title was like old Finnish people with stuff on their heads. And it was all organic materials that they were wearing on their heads. And we used a lot of it for the troll inspiration.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience if you have any. If you would, raise your hand and I'll call on you and repeat the question so everyone can hear it. So let's see, I know there was a hand up back there.
I was just curious about what were some of the incarnations of the story, and then what do you guys miss the most that was either excised or changed?
What were the incarnations of the story and what do you miss most that was excised or changed?
Elsa was a villain for several iterations, and then as the song "Let It Go" came in from Bobby and Kristen, we had worked with them for a bit before that, and then we realized, wow, she does not have to be as villainous as we were making her, or a villain at all. She's so complex. Her journey is so fascinating on its own that it was a better place to be than just a typical villain. So that was she was there for quite a while, that villain one. I guess one that I missed, there was one thing, we had a really cool introduction of Kristoff as a mountain man, mountain climber, very action intro to him, that and Sven, a very funny introduction that was just, we had to take out because of time. Never got animated, but it was storyboarded, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, the only thing I think the only thing I miss is there were very many iterations of the scene we wanted to get in there, which was the girls in the dressing room together. And for those of us who have sisters, it was just really playful, like don't borrow my things, and they were acting very much like teenage sisters do. And we just loved that relatability. But the story, once they were divided, they really needed to stay apart, and so we couldn't find a way to get that in. And that's the only thing for me that.
I missed a lot of the songs. Working with Bobby and Kristen Lopez, they gave us amazing songs every step of the way, and some of them were fantastic. I mean, it was kind of painful when it's like, well, that's not the story anymore, so we won't use that song.
But they're on the deluxe CD, which comes out on Tuesday.
Available in stores next week for $19.95.
As are,
Down here.
That's part of my question. My question was two-part. How do you balance, how do you figure out how to balance the emotional stuff with humor, like when to interject humor, and then also when to go into song? Because humor is important.
How do you balance the emotion with humor, and how do you know when to go into song?
Well, about the emotions, for me, because I'm someone who, what I always love about a lot of Disney films is you laugh and cry. And it's you feel it. And so the key to me is actually rooting the comedy in the characters. Because people are funny. In life they do ridiculous things, and even when they're going through struggles, they have moments of where you kind of break up and laugh just out of the ridiculousness of your lives, and keeping it very much that by letting the humor be organic to who they are, and the way, particularly Anna, the way she moves too fast, says, speaks before she thinks, and that's there with a sincerity through the whole movie. And then obviously with Olaf, as much as we could feel the potential of him being funny, it had to come from who he was and that nature of being a child. And I think that's how you're willing to go on an emotional journey with these characters as well, because they feel very human, even if they're snowmen, but they feel very real, and that's the key to that. And you want to talk about the music?
To your song question. A lot of times, either film or stage, as Bobby and Kristen say, a song usually it's when the emotion in a sequence or a scene is so strong that they have to sing. They have to sing it out loud, sing their emotions out loud. So that's, a lot of times you would know that we got to do a song there, or at least attempt a song there. And they would always tease Jen, though, in the same note, though. They said, well, Jen, we're going to take your best scenes, your most emotional and your funniest scenes, and we're going to make them our songs. And so, and that's sort of what they did. But and so that's really when you know you gotta have a song there. So, but we went through many. It was trial and error throughout. So,
Question over here.
I'm a woman who grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I have daughters, and I just love the strength of the women characters, and I love how unjudgmental the characters are towards the frozen sister, and the evolution towards looking at women who don't need to be saved by men and can actually team with a man. What this says about the evolution of women is just stunning, and I'm sure this was your intent, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
it was all my idea.
Actually, the funny thing is to say is what I think the key to this is balance. I think that it's who we are today. It's just sort of relatable to 2013 and what we think about and talk about. But I do think that what has been wonderful in this film is that balance of men and women working on it. And it's, animation is, more and more women have gone into animation, and you can see it. And I think what we're getting, both the men and the women, female characters, are getting more genuine, I think, and really people we know, people we want to know. I mean, I will say a wonderful goal for me was hoping that so far we've been hearing that boys relate to Anna as well, and that it doesn't matter if we're boys or girls, we relate to each other because of our journeys. And so I think for us it wasn't anything other than making it feel very organic and balanced of what the people we know.
Yeah, and I think, we each had a different perspective on the scenes, but I think with that balance, the times that we'd push and pull each other a little bit, like, would a woman really do that, or feel that, or vice versa with the main character. So I think we, in a good way, sort of challenged each other, and hopefully, as you say, we've come up with something that's believable, and I think it's a good step in a new direction.
In the animation does the fact that we're no longer in a world where this has to be about a boy meets girl story, does that free you to animate the character and design the character differently? It no longer has to be about making her a pretty princess who's going to look good matched with a prince?
Yeah. Just echoing what Chris and Jen were saying, as an animator, to have the freedom and to make certain choices is pretty incredible, to know that the payoff at the end of the film was going to be what true love really was, and not be the romantic true love. And what was really cool, animation-wise, is it was very important for us that every sequence crescendo, and that there was a natural progression in the sequence, acting-wise. And we would actually, the supervising animators and myself would hook up with Jen and Chris, and we'd build these emotional crescendo boards. And we'd mark the highs and lows of the hero characters in each sequence. And the truth behind, I feel like it's very, in my opinion, it feels like more of like a live action movie when you're watching it, because there's something in animation where it's so easy for us to put the volume on 12 the whole film, and every single animator wants to out-animate each other, and it stops becoming about the story. What was very important for us, especially when we started reading the script and seeing how rich the characters were, especially the female lead characters, we knew we had to make a map so that we weren't doing things that were too cliche, and we were being very honest with the characters. And every sequence, like I was saying, there's a natural build in crescendo, so you're looking forward to that moment. I think like the Hans reveal, I know you guys just saw it, but it's even hard for me to say the Hans reveal in front of you guys to give stuff away, but like the crafting that moment and where Anna was coming from, and her vulnerability, and the iteration and tweaking that to get just the right reaction. And as an animator, it's the ultimate thing, like sitting in an audience and seeing people lean forward and then gasp and then hear the rumblings in the room like, son of a bitch. Yeah.
I think that's all the time we have today. Thanks so much to everybody for coming out.